Ivory and Echoes. I remember the throne that gleamed like morning frost, its ivory curves overlaid with gold so bright that visitors shielded their eyes, and the steps that led up to it, flanked by carved lions that seemed almost ready to breathe. The air itself inside that hall felt heavy with the perfume of cedar beams and the hum of expectation. Courtiers whispered, choirs rehearsed, and in the hush between their voices I could almost hear the echo of my own soul, wondering how a man who once prayed with trembling lips had arrived at a seat that glowed like a star. The temple stood not far away, its pillars of bronze reflecting sunlight, its inner rooms veiled with embroidered curtains, its very stones soaked in the prayers of a nation that believed heaven had bent close. I remember kneeling there, my face pressed against the floor of polished stone, lifting words that poured like water from a full jar. Lord, there is no God like you in heaven or on earth. As I prayed, a cloud filled the courts, a weight of presence so real that every musician stopped, every priest bowed low, and we knew that glory had entered a house built by human hands, but claimed by the Eternal. The day of dedication felt like the crest of a wave, a moment when the answer to my youthful prayer at Gibeon rang louder than the trumpets. I had asked for wisdom, and heaven had not only granted understanding, but poured wealth and honor into my lap until the very abundance became a silent question. Was this overflow a blessing to hold with open hands, or a current strong enough to carry me away if I ever loosened my grip on the one who gave it? When I sat upon that golden throne, when I looked across a kingdom at peace, when I listened to the songs rising from the temple I had built, I felt the allure of answered prayers shimmering all around me. Yet deep inside, beneath the applause of nations and the glow of treasures stacked in storerooms, there stirred another sound, quieter, insistent, almost hidden. It was the whisper of risk, the reminder that abundance does not only bless, it also tests. For within every gift lies the question of whether the heart will remain steady, or whether the echo of its own footsteps will one day sound like warning in halls of ivory and gold.
The night of asking.
I remember the night air at Gibeon, cool against my skin, carrying the faint scent of earth and fire from the altars that glowed beneath the stars. The sky stretched wide and unbroken above me, a canvas of silence that felt like the waiting breath of heaven itself. I had come as a young king, uncertain of the weight now resting on my shoulders, the tribes restless, the future unwritten. My hands still bore no scars from battle. My voice still trembled with the memory of my father's final charge. And in the stillness of that night, I felt how small I truly was. I lay down with questions pressing against my chest, and in that vulnerable silence a dream came, yet it felt more like waking into a brighter world. The Lord stood near, and his voice moved through me with a clarity sharper than any trumpet call. "Ask what I shall give you." The words pierced through every hidden ambition, every imagined crown, every fleeting desire that a young ruler could harbor. I knew I could have asked for the necks of my enemies, for vaults of treasure, for years stretched long like shadows at sunset. Yet all of it tasted hollow, even as the thought brushed across my mind. So I answered with the plea that welled up from my own untried heart. Give your servant an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil. My voice within the dream quivered, yet it was the truest sound I had ever made. For I knew that without wisdom, victory would unravel, riches would corrupt, and long years would only prolong my ignorance. But with wisdom, I might walk the fragile path of justice, guarding the people entrusted to me as a shepherd guards his flock. The silence that followed felt alive, as though creation itself held its breath. Then came the warmth of divine pleasure, a presence that filled me with certainty. I had asked for the better portion. The Lord promised not only wisdom deeper than sand upon the shore, but honor and abundance that would follow like rivers in flood. The covenant pressed into my bones. If I walked in his ways, life itself would be extended like dawn spreading across the hills. I awoke with the dream still clinging to me, morning light spilling over the camp, my heart beating with a new rhythm, as if eternity had reached down and touched the fragile vessel of a young king's soul. From that day forward, I carried the memory of that night like a jewel hidden in my robe. Every judgment, every decision, every prayer returned to that sacred threshold where heaven had stooped low and asked a trembling man to choose. And I chose understanding, a choice that still speaks across the centuries to anyone willing to seek not power nor wealth, but the wisdom that alone can keep a heart aligned with the living God.
A mother's cry and a king's heart. It was not long after Gibeon that the moment came which tested the very gift I had been given. 2 women stood before me in the court, each holding to the same claim, each insisting with trembling voices that the child in question was hers. Their eyes told the story even before their words did. Eyes ringed with exhaustion, voices cracked by sleepless nights, arms aching with the memory of cradling life. There is no argument as raw, no plea as fierce as the cry of a mother, and in their dispute I felt the weight of the nation pressing down upon me. Every ear strained for my ruling, every heart waiting to see if wisdom would prove itself in the flesh. I listened, not only to their words, but to the fractures of grief beneath them. One child had died in the night, one remained alive, and the lines of accusation cut back and forth like blades. Truth seemed buried beneath sorrow, yet I sensed that love itself would draw it to the surface. So I spoke a sentence that froze the chamber. Bring me a sword, divide the living child in 2, and give half to each. Gasps filled the hall. Horror rippled like a sudden wind, and for a heartbeat the room felt as though mercy itself had fled. Yet within that silence, the truth revealed itself. One woman stepped forward, her face torn with agony, and she cried out that the child must be given to the other woman, that his life must be spared, though it cost her everything. The other remained still, her claim unbending, her heart unmoved. And in that moment it was clear. Love had spoken louder than argument. The voice of sacrifice, the willingness to lose in order to save, had unveiled the true mother. I gave my ruling, and the child was restored to the arms that had chosen mercy over possession. A great breath seemed to leave the people gathered, and awe replaced the tension that had gripped the room. Whispers spread through the crowd. This was wisdom alive, wisdom that did not simply calculate but discerned the currents of the heart. They left speaking not only of a king's judgment, but of the God who had granted it. For me, the memory of that day burned brighter than the gold of any hall. It reminded me that wisdom is not found in clever words or sharp decrees, but in the courage to trust that love will always expose itself when placed in the fire. Under the scrutiny of eyes both watchful and skeptical, restraint and tenderness proved stronger than force, and in that chamber I learned that true judgment is the art of listening for the heartbeat of truth amid the clamor of voices.
Gold that sings, and rooms that echo. The days that followed rose like a tide of splendor. Caravans entered Jerusalem from distant lands, their camels swaying beneath loads of gold and ivory, their riders draped in silks that caught the sun. Music threaded through the streets, drums and pipes carrying rhythms of celebration, while singers lifted their voices in praise of a kingdom unlike any the world had ever seen. Banquets filled the palace halls until the air itself seemed saturated with spices, laughter, and the shimmer of goblets raised high. It was as though the city itself had learned to sing, every street echoing the triumph of prosperity. My throne room became a theater of awe. Ivory and gold reflected torchlight, jewels flickered like captive stars, and the people who entered lowered their gaze in reverence that bordered on fear. Even the sound of sandals on stone seemed hushed, as if the very floor knew it was carrying the weight of history. I would sit there, the roar of choirs at my back, the gleam of treasures before my eyes, and feel the heady mixture of gratitude and danger swirl together in my chest. For abundance glitters, but it also blinds, and beneath the brilliance I began to sense a quiet tremor in the foundations of my heart. Then came the Queen of Sheba, her arrival heralded by a procession so long it seemed the desert itself had emptied into Jerusalem. Her camels bore spices that perfumed the air for days. Her attendants carried gifts of gold and stones that rivaled the treasury itself. Yet it was not wealth she sought to measure. It was wisdom. She tested me with riddles, questions coiled with cunning, challenges meant to pierce the surface of my renown, and I answered them all. Her eyes widened, her breath caught, and her voice declared that even the rumors had fallen short of the truth she had now witnessed. Her words crowned me in admiration, yet behind their sweetness, I felt a weight I could not easily shake. For as her caravan departed and the cheers of my people filled the streets, I walked alone through halls lined with gold. The music still played, yet it sounded thinner. The rooms sparkled, yet they began to echo with an unfamiliar hollowness. The queen had praised the glory she saw, but her questions lingered like shadows. Had I begun to delight more in being known for wisdom than in the God who gave it? The splendor dazzled my eyes, but in the silence after the music faded, I wondered whether the first cracks were already forming beneath the glitter that seemed so solid. The hills begin to speak. It began quietly, almost gently, the way cracks in stone often start as hairlines invisible to the eye. a treaty signed with the ink of marriage, a princess welcomed from a foreign land, her garments shimmering with the colors of her people, her voice carrying songs I did not know. At first it seemed harmless, even wise, a gesture of diplomacy that promised peace at the borders and stability within the walls. One union became several, then many, and soon the courts of Jerusalem were filled with languages, customs, and rituals that pressed against the covenant I had once guarded with trembling reverence. Each alliance carried its own price, though it was not measured in coin or armies. A request would rise, soft and tender, a small shrine, a modest altar, a place to honor the gods left behind. I told myself it was kindness, a concession born of love, a gesture that harmed no one. Yet the moment those stones were stacked, something shifted. The ridgelines that once lifted their gaze only toward the temple now bore the marks of other names, and smoke began to curl toward heaven from fires that carried prayers to powers that had no life in them. I would walk the palace corridors and hear the laughter of my wives, see the beauty of their garments, and feel both pleasure and unease coil within me. My counselors praised the strength of our alliances, my people marveled at the reach of our influence, and the world envied the harmony I appeared to command. Yet within the stillness of my chamber, I could hear the hills begin to speak. They spoke with the low hum of altars rising, with the steady beat of drums that did not belong to Yahweh, with the faint but unmistakable bending of the horizon of worship. The theology of small permissions whispered in my ear, assuring me that one shrine was trivial compared to the temple's grandeur, that one concession was swallowed by the abundance of sacrifices offered in Jerusalem. But faith does not fracture in grand collapses alone. It erodes with the steady drip of compromise, drop by drop, until the stone of devotion wears thin. And as the hills around the holy city filled with other fires, I felt a tremor deep within, though I turned away from it, convincing myself that peace and prosperity could justify the bending of my soul. The hills had begun to speak, and though their voices were faint, they carried a warning as sharp as a prophet's cry. When the horizon of worship tilts, the heart follows, and even a kingdom bathed in light can find its sky slowly darkening.
The divided room.
That night I remained awake long after the lamps had burned low, their smoke curling upward like fragile prayers that lost themselves in the rafters. I spread my hands as I once did in the temple, but the words that rose from my lips fell back heavy, clattering like stones instead of lifting like incense. The chamber was filled with treasures gathered from distant lands, bowls of gold and vessels carved with care, yet the very abundance mocked me, reminding me that my heart no longer beat with the single rhythm it once knew. I tried to pray, but the names pressed against me, names of gods whispered in my courts, names of wives who sought my favor, names of nations whose peace seemed to rest upon my concessions. Each name tugged at me, and my words stumbled. I remembered the night at Gibeon, the purity of a request that asked only for wisdom, and I felt how far I had wandered from that clarity. My lips formed petitions, yet my spirit faltered, divided, pulled apart like fabric stretched too thin. The silence inside the room grew heavier than any voice. It wrapped itself around me, pressing against my chest, making even the sound of my breathing feel like an intrusion. Once I had heard God answer with a cloud of glory. Once I had felt His pleasure fill the temple like fire. But now the heavens seemed locked, and every syllable I uttered dissolved before it reached them. I wondered if the God who had promised to dwell among His people still lingered here, or if He had already turned His face from the King who had traded devotion for diplomacy. I shifted upon the floor, forehead against the cold stone, whispering fragments of psalms my father had sung. "Create in me a clean heart," I murmured, yet the words trembled, uncertain whether they belonged to me any more. For what is a clean heart when it has been divided 1,000 times, when love has become entangled with politics and worship diluted by a chorus of foreign songs? I lifted my face, but the darkness only deepened. That night, the room itself felt divided, half filled with the memory of God's nearness, half crowded with the weight of my compromises. And within that divided room sat a divided man, torn between the covenant of his youth and the alliances of his age, speaking prayers that no longer soared, listening for a voice that no longer answered.
When wisdom forgets its own voice.
I've found myself repeating words I had once spoken with conviction, proverbs that had flowed like clear water when my heart still burned with devotion. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. I had written it with the certainty of revelation, yet the words echoed back to me in the quiet of my chamber. They carried the sting of irony. My lips moved, but my life contradicted the very counsel I had given. The wisdom that once guided nations now sounded like a voice speaking through hollow walls. Courtiers still gathered to hear me. Scribes still recorded my sayings, and travelers still came to marvel at the depth of my insight. They left praising the brilliance of Solomon, yet inside I felt the dissonance sharpen. I could describe the path of righteousness, but my feet had begun to wander on another road. I could teach restraint, yet my own desires multiplied without measure. The words survived, but the practice withered, and wisdom separated from obedience grew brittle like parchment left too long in the sun. I told myself that speaking the truth was enough, that if the people lived by my sayings, the kingdom would endure, even if my own heart faltered. Self-deception is a subtle companion. It whispers that influence outweighs integrity, that legacy can excuse compromise. I let that voice grow familiar, comforting me as I drifted further from the flame that had once burned within me. I looked at my own writings and felt both pride and weariness, as though the fountain that once bubbled fresh now poured only through effort, not delight. There is a fatigue that comes when the appetite of the soul no longer stirs, when words that once fed you now taste like dry grain. I spoke, but I did not drink. I taught, but I did not live. And in the hollow space between what I declared and what I embodied, a shadow grew. Wisdom without practice had become noise, and the voice that had once guided kings and mothers alike now echoed back to me as a reminder of what I had lost.
My own sayings turned against me, and I heard them as a witness rather than a companion, calling me to remember the God whose presence I had slowly allowed to fade.
The prophet at the gate of Splendor.
The halls of my palace still gleamed, their walls adorned with treasures brought from every horizon. Yet into that glow stepped a figure whose presence carried more weight than gold. A prophet, robed in simplicity, eyes burning with the clarity of one who had stood in the counsel of the Lord. He did not bow, he did not flatter. His words were not woven with the silk of diplomacy, but cut with the sharp edge of truth. He spoke of warnings given and ignored, of a God whose patience is long, but whose holiness cannot be mocked. And as his voice rose, the glitter of the palace seemed to dull, as though the very stones remembered that they were dust beneath the gaze of heaven. He reminded me of the covenant, of the nights when God had appeared to me with promises bright as dawn, urging me to walk in obedience so that the throne might endure. Twice the Lord had drawn near, twice he had cautioned me, twice he had offered the mercy of correction. The prophet's voice trembled with the weight of those encounters, pressing upon me the reality that blessing carries responsibility, that favor is not a shield against consequence, but a summons to holiness. I heard his words, and for a moment the fog lifted, and I saw my life not in the glow of prosperity, but in the light of eternity. Yet, even in his sternness there was mercy. His rebuke was not meant to crush, but to awaken, to call me back before the fracture grew into ruin. The warning itself was grace, a hand stretched out at the very edge of the cliff. The prophet's face carried sorrow more than anger, as though he longed for me to remember who I had been when I first asked for wisdom at Gibeon, when humility was my crown and obedience my strength. His voice, though severe, was laced with hope that even now the story could bend back toward faithfulness. But I sat upon my throne, surrounded by splendor, torn between the urgency of his call and the weight of the habits I had chosen. The prophet's presence left me shaken, yet when he departed, the music of the court returned, the laughter of the halls resumed, and I allowed the mercy embedded in the warning to slip like water through my fingers. The gate of splendor had been opened to confrontation, and mercy had walked in. But I chose to close the door softly behind him, convincing myself that tomorrow would be soon enough to change.
Kingdoms that tear along old seams. The kingdom still shone outwardly, banners lifted high, armies disciplined, treasuries brimming. Yet within that brilliance I could feel the fabric loosening. What had once been woven tight with covenant threads began to strain, pulling apart along the very lines that my own heart had frayed. The splendor of Israel was a tapestry, but I, its maker and steward, had allowed strands of compromise to unravel the pattern. And in time, what breaks within the soul of a king finds its echo in the soil of a nation. Alliances that once promised peace now demanded loyalties. Loyalties that divided worship now demanded tolerance. Tolerance that seemed harmless became policy. The hills spoke with their altars, and the people followed where their king had led. The covenant that had made us distinct became blurred at the edges until the people no longer asked whether Yahweh alone should be worshipped, but whether worship itself was negotiable. My fracture had become theirs, my divided heart mirrored in a divided nation. Rumors of unrest stirred in the north.
Tribes that had once sung together in Jerusalem now grumbled about burdens, about favoritism, about the weight of a throne more consumed with display than with justice. Advisors counseled me, but their voices were muffled beneath the noise of banquets and the machinery of endless projects. I pressed taxes heavier, demanded labor longer, convincing myself that greatness required sacrifice, blind to the fact that it was not greatness but obedience that secured the heart of the people. Prophetic words returned to me like haunting echoes. The kingdom would not be torn in my lifetime for the sake of David, yet the rent was certain, the judgment assured. And I began to see it unfold like a garment unraveling in slow motion. Threads pulled from the edges, seams loosening, patterns breaking. The unity that once defined us was slipping away, and I knew, though I resisted admitting it, that this was no political miscalculation, but a spiritual fracture rippling outward. The land mirrored the man. Where my soul had been divided, the kingdom divided. Where I had chosen splendor over devotion, the people chose grievance over loyalty. What tore inside me tore outside me, and the tapestry that had once dazzled the nations now sagged under the weight of seams pulling apart.
Vapor on the tongue. I sat within rooms that overflowed with treasure, yet the air inside them felt thin, as if wealth itself could not fill the lungs. I walked through gardens planted with every fragrance, yet their beauty faded the moment I turned away. I heard the laughter of banquets echo against marble walls, yet the sound dissolved into silence as quickly as poured wine sinks into the earth. And the word that rose again and again upon my lips was one that tasted bitter no matter how I shaped it, meaningless, like vapor on the tongue, fleeting, insubstantial, gone before it can be grasped. I told myself that knowledge would satisfy, so I gathered wisdom until my scrolls filled chambers. Yet the more I learned, the heavier the burden became. I told myself that pleasure would heal, so I pursued delight until my nights blurred into music and wine. Yet the morning light exposed the emptiness still lingering. I told myself that labor would justify my breath, so I built and planted and designed. Yet each monument whispered back to me that the one who came after would inherit both the glory and the burden, and what was mine would slip through my fingers as though it had never been. Meaningless, I said, utterly meaningless, a chasing after wind. And in those words I diagnosed the sickness of my own soul, for wisdom without obedience is hunger without bread, and pleasure without devotion is thirst without water. My heart had turned from the giver and grasped at the gifts, and in doing so the sweetness of every gift soured upon my tongue. What once sparkled with promise dulled to ash, and I felt the weight of my life collapsing inward like a house built on sand. Yet in the emptiness a truth broke through, fragile at first, then steady as sunrise. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of mankind. I whispered it as a confession. I repeated it as a prayer. I clung to it as the last rope still tied to the anchor of my soul. And in that moment, the taste of obedience returned like water to a dry mouth, simple, unadorned, pure.
not the intoxication of splendor, not the fever of indulgence, but the quiet refreshment of knowing that to walk humbly with the Lord is life itself. Everything else had proven vapor, but this remained. The fear of God steadied my hands, the keeping of His word steadied my heart, and for the first time in many years I felt the wind shift, not chasing after it, but carried by it, toward the one whose breath had given me life in the first place.
The doorway back. As the years slipped into shadows, and the voices of courtiers grew faint behind me, I came at last to a stillness that felt like truth, not the dazzling truth of riddles answered or judgments rendered, but the quiet truth that waits at the edge of every life. I saw the palaces, the processions, the altars on distant hills, and I knew that all of it, whether triumph or failure, had been vapor carried by the wind. Yet one sentence remained, steady as stone beneath the shifting sand. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. I speak it now as both confession and invitation. Confession, because I learned too late that wisdom without obedience becomes self-deception, and abundance without devotion becomes dust. Invitation, because even as my story bends beneath the weight of regret, the doorway back is still open for any who will walk through it. The God who warned me also sustained me. The God who judged me also offered mercy. And the God who saw my divided heart still called me to return. So hear this, you who listen in a different time, yet face the same temptations of comfort, compromise, and pride. Your life is not measured by splendor, but by faithfulness, not by monuments, but by devotion, not by applause, but the quiet endurance of trust. Let my story search you, not to condemn, but to awaken. For obedience is the medicine that restores, the water that quenches, the light that steadies your steps when the path grows dim. If this story has touched your heart, then carry it forward. Share it with one who may be wandering. Offer it to someone who sits in silence and wonders whether God still calls their name. Give it away like bread placed in an open hand, for you never know whose hunger it may satisfy. And if it has spoken to you, then let your voice echo back, not for numbers or applause, but so that the message may reach the one who waits in the dark for a sign of hope. Like, comment, and subscribe, not as ritual, but as the small act that passes light from one soul to another. And now, may the God who filled the temple with glory fill your own heart with His presence. May the one who warned Solomon also guide you, the one who judged Israel also cover you with mercy, and the one who saw vapor into meaning also breathe life into your days. Walk through the doorway back, for it still stands open, and may you find beyond it the wisdom, blessing, and eternal life that never fade. Amen.